I'm going to begin my message today at a place called Thermopylae. It's a place that's quite famous for historians. Modern Greek, it's called Thermopolis, and it's also spelt Thermopylae. Now, it means it's a narrow pass on the east coast of central Greece between Kalidorum Massif and the Gulf of Miliakos. It's about 85 miles or 136 kilometers northwest of the capital city Athens, or Athena. In antiquity, its cliffs were by the sea, but silting has widened the distance to more than a mile, and its name means hot gates, Thermopylae. It's derived from its hot sulfur springs that are in that part of the world. And the Greeks also used to refer to that place as the gates to Hades, or death, because Hades was the god of the underworld in that time. The pass has some 6 kilometers in length and it's been a famous place for numerous invasions in the Greek kingdom, because the Greeks didn't just fight other countries, they fought amongst themselves at a time where the city-states would fight each other. The Athenians obviously didn't like the Spartans. There was also the Corinthians, Thebans, and all the other city-states that were in the Greek kingdom. It wasn't until Alexander the Great united the Greek kingdom and they became that mighty empire that we know in biblical prophecy as well. But anyway, here in August, so many years ago, same time, all these thousands of years ago, in 480 years before Christ, during the second Persian invasion of Greece, a small Greek force under the Spartan king Leonidas, wonderfully portrayed by Gerard Butler in a movie that I watched 17 years ago. I was 15 years old. It went so quickly. It still feels like it's a new film adaptation, but it's been that long. King Leonidas defended Attica and Boeotia against the southward advance of Xerxes' Persian army, while Greek fleets nearby Cape Artemisium fought off the Persian navy as well. Leonidas' troops held the pass for 3 days until the Persians, guided along another mountain pass by a Greek traitor, Ephialtes, and the Persians managed to outflank the Spartans. Sending the majority of his troops to safety, Leonidas remained to delay the Persians with 300 Spartans, the Helots, and 1,100 Boeotians, all whom died in battle. So there were more than 300 soldiers in this story. But these 300 Spartans are famous and have been put into Greek legend for holding off such a big Persian force in that time. And although the Persians won this battle, they won at Thermopylae and they conquered central Greece, they suffered considerable losses in that battle. And most of the Greek troops and ships were able to escape the Isthmus of Corinth up north to rejoin the main Greek forces. And this battle became celebrated in history and literature as an example of heroic resistance against great odds. A large marble and bronze monument commemorating the battle was erected in 1955. And in 279 BC, the Greeks delayed the invading Celts there as well, the Celts at Thermopylae. And in 191 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus III, he fortified the pass against the Romans under Acilius Glabrio. The Bible, however, has a more impressive story of 300 fighting men and how God helped them defeat a much larger force as well. Let's look at the Israelite judge Gideon And who was Gideon in the Bible, you may ask? A lot of us, if we've grown up in church, we've heard this story before, but we're going to look at it in a different angle today. Still what you all already may have heard, but we're going to do a little bit of extra study today. So Gideon was one of the many leaders in the book of Judges who saved the Israelites from various enemies. You can turn to Judges now if you'd like. I will tell you where in Judges we're going to be looking later on. And Gideon most likely lived around the 12th century before Christ. So that would have been, 12th century. That would have been, 11 or 1200 BC. And his story is told throughout the chapters of Judges 6 to 8. So you can turn to Judges 6 now. And in Gideon's time, Israel had been taken over by the dominating Midianites, who had oppressed them and stolen their food and resources for over 7 years. Times must have been tough for the Israelites then. With God's help, Gideon rallied troops to overthrow the Midianites and then continued to lead the nation of Israel for another 40 years, actually, not 30 years, 40 years. So let's begin in Judges chapter 6, verse 1. And it recaps and builds a background for us of what was going on in Israel at the time. So Judges 6, verse 1. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. The Israelites lost their independence. The Midianites had dominion over God's people. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people invaded the country. Verse 4. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the land of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hands of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their lands. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live, but you have not listened to me." The angel of the Lord came and sat down under an oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrites, where his son Gideon, our main character, was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now, Israel had a fallout with God. They disobeyed him and started worshipping the gods of the neighboring kingdoms. The Midianites in the Bible were an early Arabic group that conflicted with Israelite people from around the 13th century to the 11th century in history. And the Midianites were a nomadic tribe, like the Mongols we may know, or the Huns in history. And or even the Vikings to a certain degree. They wandered from place to place, and even though they were associated with the Israelites through Abraham's lineage, you see the Midianites came from another wife that Abraham had generations back, right? They were descendants of Abraham as well. So Abraham had his first wife, Sarah, and Sarah had Isaac, and through Isaac the Israelites continued the lineage. But the Midianites were descendants of Abraham and his second wife, Keturah, through Midian. We're aware of Hagar, who gave birth to Ishmael, but Abraham also had Keturah, and the Midianites were descendants from Abraham's second wife, Keturah. So they were relatives in a way, but they fought. And nonetheless, the Midianites are considered to be one of the earliest Arabic tribes, even though there is a limited archaeological history of the tribe. And I wonder why? Because they were a nomadic people. It's hard to get archaeological evidence from groups of people who traveled around a lot. And not everything about the Midianites in the Bible is bad. We may remember Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. He was a Midianite too. So not all Midianites were evil people, but this group, they were. And they harassed Israel, but God allowed that to happen because the Israelites also turned their back on God too. And when you don't have that relationship with God, God can't protect you. It's another one of those recurring things that we see in humanity's relationship with God. The Midianites were so powerful in the region of the tribe of Manasseh, which is where Gideon was from, and that the Israelites were forced to abandon their open fields, so they couldn't farm in natural circumstances. They were forced to abandon these places and take shelter in little caves. They had to grow things in little caves or anywhere where they weren't directly seen by the Midianite people. So mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds were places where the simple duty of growing your own food had to be done in hiding. How does the story continue in chapter 6, verse 13 of Judges? Gideon's very well mannered, as we see here. "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us to the hand of Midian." Sometimes it can be like that, right? Why is this happening to me? Well, we already introduced why it's been happening. The people of God turned their back on God. And in verse 14, the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Gideon must have been a bit put off guard by this. "What, me? Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied once again. "But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." So Gideon didn't even have a high position in the ranks of his family. So you could see here that he was not confident with this order that God was giving him. Now Manasseh wasn't a strong tribe at that time either. Gideon's clan had no strength. They were hiding every little errand that they were doing. And it wasn't just a simple act of going to Coles or Woolworths back then to get a bag of flour. They had to thresh the wheat and grind everything by hand. Everything back then must have been a much more complex task. And even these days in the 21st century, those simple things, sometimes we feel like we might be running out of time to do those things ourselves these days. So it must have been even more difficult back then. Gideon wasn't even in his youth then, and we'll find that out later. But I thought I'd mention that as well. That's also another reason why Gideon wasn't so confident. He must have felt like he was aged past his prime, and he didn't really have much to give. He just had to go with whatever was coming his way. Go with the flow, you could say. He was hiding in a wine press after all, just to thresh the grain. And this is what God says in verse 16. "The Lord answered, 'I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive.' Gideon replied, 'If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that is really you talking to me. Please "Do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." And the Lord said, "I will wait until you return." So these are my thoughts after this part. Gideon's faith in God needed to grow. We see here that God gave him the support. God reassuringly says, "I'll be here. Bring your offering and let's work from there." Verse 19. Gideon went inside and prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock and pour out the broth." And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Let's just pause there for a second. We're mid-verse. Gideon wasn't actually sure if he was talking to God still. He didn't know that he was talking to an angel, and we're about to find that out. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord did what? Disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." Gideon thought he might die soon because he had direct contact with God in a way through seeing the angel. But the Lord said to him, "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." So Gideon built an altar to the Lord and called it "The Lord is Peace." To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. That same night the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of it of this height, using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down. Offer the second bull as a burnt offering." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. And we're going to see what happens next. In the morning, when the people of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it cut down, and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. They asked each other, "Who did this?" There must have been an outrage in the village. They did not like this. When they carefully investigated, they were told Gideon, the son of Joash, did it. The people of the town demanded Joash, "Gideon, bring out your son, Gideon. He must die because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." This is where I like Gideon's father, because I like the case that he presents here. But Joash, Gideon's father, replied to the hostile crowd around him, "Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." So because Gideon broke down Baal's altar, they gave him the name Jerubbaal. So that was Gideon's new title or nickname, you could say. They gave him that name that day, saying, "Let Baal contend with him." Now the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan, the river, and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor where he threshes his wheat. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand." So Gideon here asks for something that is very difficult to happen, almost impossible, you could say. And he asks God, "Show me this act, and you've won me over. I will cooperate with you, God." And this is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, and he got a bowl full of water, it says. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request." So we see here that Gideon was not testing God to be arrogant. He was not testing God to have an excuse out of doing God's work. Gideon actually just wanted to be sure of himself. He understood that he lacked faith. And he wanted to test God in the healthy way. "Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." He just asked for the opposite. That night, God did so. Only the fleece was dry and all the ground was covered with dew. My thoughts on this, we see here that Gideon continues to test God, but as we see, he's doing so in a humble spirit, in humility. And he only wants to grow his faith and to be more confident with the calling that God gives him. Now this is the story that we know so well. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, who we know is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. And there were a lot of men that gathered there. Because in verse 2 we see this. This is chapter 7, verse 2, by the way. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands." Or Israel would what? Boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. So we see here, there are over 30,000 people that gathered at that camp. Who would complain about having 30,000 soldiers at their side? That's quite a formidable force in that day and age. Yet God foresaw that if Israel had too many people, he wouldn't be able to work his power to deliver the Israelites. So it's interesting that God already could see that where the credit would go, it had all those fighting men stayed. God also shared his reasoning with Gideon. He actually said to Gideon why these men need to go home and not stick around. It shows that Gideon's faith still needed to strengthen. So God had to reassure him and explain to him, look, I can't have all these men stick around, otherwise everyone will just go back to their normal ways and they won't give me the credit for helping them deliver the Israelites from the Midianites. And then we see that God wanted even more men sent back. Verse 4 says this, "But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water and I will thin them out for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. So there were only 300 men who kind of stayed below, cupped the water and drank. Whereas the others, water. They bowed down to the water and they weren't even aware of what was going on around them. and the majority were sent packing back home. And I wonder why God decided to choose the people that were on their knees. What I see is that they were alert people. They were people that realized that, hey, we're in a war zone right now. We could get attacked at any moment. Complacency is real. And God could see that. Who has complacencies here? I definitely do. When it comes to doing paperwork sometimes, when it comes to doing the dishes sometimes, when it comes to do all those simple things, we can sometimes get very complacent. God likes people who are alert and all in for the cause. So we need to guard against the spirit of complacency. 1 Peter 5 verse 8 says this, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." And Ephesians, the book we study at Sabbath school, also says this very similar along the same lines. "And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people." These men who cupped their hands and didn't immerse themselves in the water as they took a drink, they were the men that were alert. They were looking out not just for themselves, but their brothers in arms, you could say. And those are the men that God wanted to execute this operation. And we read further on. "The Lord said to Gideon, with 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." This is a promise that God gives to Gideon. So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern people had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream, and this man was heard saying these things. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them, with torches inside. So they would have a flaming torch. They concealed the torch with the vase, and you will see what happens next. "Watch me," he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. Just after they had changed the guard, they blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets, smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. This must have created some sort of noise that the Midianites were frightened by. And the fires were there, and they had this impression that something catastrophic for them was going on. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. So the enemy army started fighting one another. And we go down to verse 24. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters and off the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah." So the Midianite camp was defeated. They went all their separate ways. But there was a further chase to follow as Gideon was chasing the Midianites away from Israel. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-barah. They also captured two of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. Chapter 8 now. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this?" The Ephraimites weren't happy, we can see here. "Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. But he answered them, "What have I accomplished compared to you?" He starts really softly, you see here, and we'll see why that is important. Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeb to the Midianite leaders into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you? At this, their resentment against him subsided. And Ellen White writes in Patriarchs and Prophets, chapter 53, "The spirit of jealousy might easily have been fanned into a quarrel that would have caused strife and bloodshed amongst the Israelites as well." But Gideon's modest answer soothed the anger of the men of Ephraim, and they returned in peace to their homes. Firm and uncompromising where principle was concerned, and in war a mighty man of valor, Gideon displayed also a spirit of courtesy that is rarely witnessed. Sometimes a gentle answer is all that is needed. We can't always be aggressive, even amongst one another. There's a bigger fight outside of our circles. How often we quarrel amongst ourselves over the least significant things sometimes. We need to hold that thought and learn how to deal with one another, because we are on the same side at the end of the day. Let's read the story on. Chapter 8, verse 4. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. He said to the men of Succoth, "Give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." So he stopped at another place in Israel and seeked sustenance. But the officials of Succoth said, "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops?" Not a very nice response, is it? Then Gideon replied, "Just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars." From there he went up to Peniel and made the same request of them, but they answered as the men of Succoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, "When I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men. All that were left in the armies of the eastern people. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. For 300 soldiers in that camp that sounded those trumpets and defeating hundreds of thousands of men, that is some statistic. To defeat an army of that size. They were really like the locusts or the sands of the desert, you can see here. Hundreds of thousands of people. I remember seeing a concert done by a big band after the Soviet Union ended. I won't mention which band, but it was one of the biggest concerts, thousands upon thousands of people, and even that looked like it was too many people to attend a live music show. This must have been something else. A lot of bodies to bury too after these 300 men defeated them. Gideon went up, this is verse 11, Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Nobah and Jogbehah and attacked the unsuspecting army. So the element of surprise was played there. Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Heres. He caught a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth, the elders of the town. Then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, 'Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men?' He took the elders of the town and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He had also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. Then he asked Zebah and Zalmunna, 'What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?' 'Men like you,' they answered, 'each one with the bearing of a prince.' Gideon replied, 'Those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you.' Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, 'Kill them.' But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid." So here we see Gideon had a son. Gideon was not a young man. He had a boy who was in old enough to fight battles, but still pretty young to be able to take orders like this, because he was still a bit rattled at the idea of executing someone, we see here. Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Come, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." So Gideon stepped forward and killed them and took the ornaments of their camels' necks. Now these men were only killed because they had an opportunity to be kind and support God's people, but they decided to play the arrogant card and taunted Gideon and his men. "Have you got these guys that you're chasing yet or not?" And that was their end. Verse 22, the story goes on. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hands of Midian." Here in this verse we see this Gideon could have been the first king of Israel. If he wanted power for himself, this was his opportunity to become the king of a nation. And a lot of the kingdoms around Israel were ruled by kings and queens at the time. This wasn't the opportune moment. Gideon would have been king much longer before the first king of Israel came to be. This was before the time of Saul, the time of David. If things were different with Gideon's motives, history would have been a lot different in the kingdom of Israel. This was Gideon's response. But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. And they answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So it didn't really end up very well. And then we have Gideon's death and his legacy. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise his head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. 40 years, Gideon's rule was so good that Israel didn't even have any trouble, and that was all thanks to God blessing him. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. I don't know if God condones that, but that's how it was at the time. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god, and they did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in spite of all the good things he had done for them. Sometimes I can see here that Gideon experienced what Christ experienced when he died for us. Giving all these things, saving people from sin, conquering it. Yet certain people still fall into their old ways. It's not a very nice ending, apart from that part that we always look at in the children's story where they were victorious. Yes, they were victorious. But the unfortunate thing is that Israel still went back to its old ways without God. So how old was Gideon when God called him? Even though the Bible doesn't specify how old Gideon was, Judges 8 tells us that he ruled for 40 years and he died when he was old. So he would have been in his middle ages when he was called to serve God and deliver Israel from the hands of the Midianites. Why did God choose Gideon, do we think? While we don't know exactly why God chose Gideon to lead, we do know that God likes to choose unlikely heroes in the Bible. When God first appeared to Gideon, Gideon was discouraged and doubtful. He had settled for survival, but God took Gideon step by step until he became a very courageous leader. So much so that he had an offer to become a king on the table for ruling Israel. He had that offer on the table to be king. Gideon is a great example of how God can use anyone to lead, and he can do the same in our own lives, because we all have some sort of leadership responsibilities, especially in the decisions that we make. Who will we decide to put our faith in? Who do we invest our time in? Do we follow God? So if we're feeling a bit like Gideon at the beginning of the story, how do we follow in his footsteps to become faithful, strong leaders in our own lives? Let's take a look at some of those small steps that Gideon took so we can stop settling and deal with our doubts and take that action. But what about that aftermath? It's important for us to hold on faithfully to God's ways, we see. We see that we didn't just look at Gideon's success in this story. Tragically, Israel slumped back to their godless ways, which made them suffer more, unfortunately. And this is what Ellen White writes in chapter 53 of Patriarchs and Prophets. As his people returned to their evil ways, the Lord permitted them to be still oppressed by their powerful enemies, the Philistines. For many years, they were constantly harassed and at times completely subjugated by this cruel and warlike nation. They had mingled with these idolaters, uniting them with the pleasure and in worship, until they seemed to be one with them in spirit and interest. then these professed friends of Israel became their bitterest enemies and sought by every means to accomplish their destruction. At first, everything was really good with the Philistines and the Israelites. But later on, we know what happens. There were so many wars with the Philistines and the Israelites where God had to call other people to rise up and defeat the Philistines later on. Like Israel, Christians too often yield to the influence of the world and conform to its principles and customs in order to secure the friendship of the ungodly. We need to be careful. It's good to be friends with people, but we can't be influenced in the wrong way. But in the end, it will be found that these professed friends are the most dangerous of foes. The Bible plainly teaches that there can be no harmony between the people of God and the world. Marvel not, my brethren, if the world hate you. 1 John 3:13. Our Saviour says, ye know that it hated me before it hated you. John 15:18. Satan works through the ungodly under cover of a pretended friendship to allure God's people into sin that he may separate them from him. And when their defense is removed, then he will lead his agents to turn against them and seek to accomplish their destruction. So as much as this story shows us a promise of how God can make leaders of us in our lives, it's also a precautionary tale to stick with God. Without God, there is so much that can go wrong, we see. With God, no matter what goes wrong, he sees us through. Let's think of the feel-good part of Gideon's success, but let's not forget ultimately that it was all God. God reaches out to us too. So let's learn to trust him as Gideon did. Because on the other side, the flip side, the situation doesn't look so good as we see here in chapter 53 of Patriarchs and Prophets. So my wish is that we have that faith of Gideon, that we test God in humility, that we are wary of the people that we associate ourselves with, but also support one another in faith as well. So it's good to see everyone here today. Let's hold that thought. Amen.